Good morning, Sherlock. Endocrine disruptors are special chemicals. They are encrusted in thousands of consumer products. Bisphenol A became the most famous when it was banned from baby bottles. But that was just a trifle. They are in cosmetics, plastics, pesticides, everywhere. There may be hundreds of them, seeping into bodies, into nature. Blood, umbilical cords, breast milk, rivers, polar bears, your mother. We're surrounded. Endocrine means hormonal. Endocrine disruptors hijack the hormonal system and play with hormones such as testosterone and estrogens. Fetuses are the most vulnerable, those who don't have the choice. Unborn children, that means us. If our hormones are disrupted during pregnancy, they can leave a ticking time bomb which will explode inside us years later. Infertility, genital abnormalities, breast, prostate, or testicle cancer, precocious puberty, developmental problems, obesity, diabetes. Endocrine disruptors are all suspected culprits. Europe promised to protect us, the future generations. But something went wrong. Your mission is to go back to 2009 and find out why. Good luck! Good luck!
At the European level, the debate about endocrine disruptors started way back in the 1990s with alarming signs of declines in male fertility and also about endocrine disrupting effects in fish, particularly in UK rivers. Male fish all of a sudden were shown to make female egg yolk protein. This was really strange. And a lot of concerns arose from that.
There are so many, literally thousands of studies that have shown the adverse effects of endocrine disruptors on wildlife and also humans. And since this is a very powerful effect as it intervenes during development and creates irreversible effects, that we can just no longer ignore this and have to act.
The diseases in humans we are concerned about in connection with endocrine disruptors concern malformations of the penis in boys, non-descending testes cancer, for example, prostate cancer also, and in women, breast cancer, polycystic fibrosis and disorders of this kind. It has to be stated that among scientists, among practitioners of endocrine disruptor research, there is really a very broad consensus. There's a broad consensus about that these chemicals are dangerous and that they require a special approach in chemical regulation.
My mission report starts at the European Parliament in 2009. The members of the Parliament decide that endocrine disruptors should be regulated, some even banned. It's high time for us future Europeans to be protected. But how do you recognize an endocrine disruptor from just any other chemical? Europe needs a special tool to spot them wherever they're hiding. In the toaster, toothpaste, or in yesterday's leftovers. The tool in question is an official definition. The European Commission has until the end of 2013, no longer, to find the words.
There is great speculation at the moment among regulatory bodies in Europe how many chemicals would be caught out by regulation as an endocrine disruptor. The truth of the matter is no one knows.
The big deal about this is that it will basically be an official system of saying, yes, this is an endocrine disruptor, and no, this isn't, and yes, this one is a suspected endocrine disruptor. And we don't have that until now.
When we make criteria for identifying endocrine disruptors, we'll be the first in the world to have them. And therefore, being the first in the world has a number of business benefits. It also has a number of potential costs.
Le dossier de la perturbation endocrinienne est un dossier qui concerne l'ensemble des secteurs d'activité. Et si on prend la chimie, donc le secteur de la chimie générale, les cosmétiques, l'industrie pharmaceutique, les produits de protection des plantes, donc les pesticides, les biocides que l'on utilise donc à la maison pour les mouches, les cafards, les moustiques, sont donc tous concernés à des degrés variables d'ailleurs par cette fameuse perturbation endocrinienne.
The industry is up in arms and is mobilizing to make sure that the definition of endocrine disruptors is as limited as possible, basically because they want to continue putting their products onto the market without any interference by the regulator.
For Parliament, scientists and NGOs, finding a definition for endocrine disruptors is an emergency. However, the industry considers it a threat for thousands of products. But the responsibility for the final decision lies with the European Commission. Our destiny is in its hands. A battle breaks out behind the scenes of European democracy. This definition will concern all economic sectors: plastics, detergents, foodstuffs. Sent to the front line, the chemical and pesticide industry unite forces to cut losses. The formula for successful lobbying? Capture the public decision. Yet democracy, according to the Commission, consists in a dialogue with stakeholders, a code name for NGOs representing civil society, and with industry representing industry.
CEFIC is the industry association in Brussels for the European chemical industry. And its objective is to represent the interests of the industry within the Brussels environment. And it has about a 40-year history of doing that. And we have about 150 people in total.
We maybe have about 10 to 12 people, possibly a few more, in the various organizations following endocrine disruptors and the development of policy here in Brussels.
L'industrie chimique a cette chance d'avoir suffisamment de moyens pour démarcher absolument tout le monde, y compris leurs ennemis, y compris leurs alliés, et y compris les indécis, alors que typiquement les ONG, elles, n'ont les moyens que de se focaliser sur les indécis.
The way I see democracy playing out in a situation like this, in the thinking of where the Commission is that it's important to retain a dialogue at all times with all stakeholders who've got useful information.
The European Commission and the member states pay attention to NGOs because they see us as the representative of the public interest. But there are times when definitely it feels like we're a voice in the wilderness.
In Brussels, lobbying targets decision makers who work in the offices of the European Commission. They are the Directorates General, known as the DGs. Each of them is in charge of a specific sector. DG Sanko, for example, is responsible for health and consumers. DG Enterprise for industry. DGs are headed by commissioners, super ministers, below the president, José Manuel Barroso, in the hierarchy. DG Environment is designated as the chef de file on the endocrine disruptor file. Welcome. Its job? To establish a list of scientific criteria in order to produce an identikit of the possible culprits and help get rid of them. This important responsibility is entrusted to a handful of civil servants in Unit D3, 5th floor, end of the corridor, on the left.
It's very similar to when we started regulating chemicals that cause cancer. That in the beginning, we didn't even have a definition for what we meant with a chemical causing cancer, and we didn't have detailed criteria.
The question is how to identify endocrine disruptors, what set of characteristics they have to fulfill that you call these substances endocrine disruptors.
The difficulty in developing criteria is in the first instance to understand what is the science, what's the state of science.
DG Environment commissioned a study to find out what was the latest science about endocrine disrupting chemicals. The group of people that got the contract to do this study was a group of people led by Professor Andreas Kortenkamp, who is one of the world's leading authorities on endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Hormones have various functions in our bodies, but during development they have a very important function, which is programming. They program our development. And certain chemicals have the ability to interfere with these programming effects of hormones, for example, in fetal life. And that can have quite severe and irreversible consequences for life into adulthood, for the rest of someone's life. For example, the fetus has to be exposed during a precise window to fetal androgens, the male sex hormone, and that triggers the differentiation of the male fetus into a male. If this doesn't happen, then we can expect various signs of demasculinization. For example, the urethra doesn't end up on the end of the penis as it should, but on the underside. So chemicals a pregnant mother is exposed to during these times will disturb this and may have these irreversible effects. And that is something that separates them from the toxicity of many other chemicals.
Thank you.
The report which we have written, the state-of-the-art assessment on endocrine disruptors, was very positively and gladly received by the European Commission.
What the report concludes is indeed that this is an issue which needs policy attention, and that the science base, and that was for us the very important conclusion in the report, that the scientific basis for developing legislation or for developing policy has significantly improved and is rather solid.
It was not so gladly received by industrial circles.
No sooner published in early 2012, the Kortenkamp report becomes the object of a series of attacks disguised as critiques. Most of these are financed by the industry and entrusted to scientific lobbying firms. The business of these companies is to produce scientific material used to convince the authorities in defense of dangerous products like bisphenol A, pesticides or cigarettes.
Une des tactiques systématiques, malheureusement, employées par l'industrie dans cet exercice-là, c'est d'attaquer évidemment non seulement les études qui vont contre son sens, mais également les scientifiques qui sont les auteurs de ces études-là.
When reading some of the critiques of the Kortenkamp report, one was struck by how easy it is to do a critique. You read a report of some hundreds of pages, 2,000 references, carefully prepared by not one but several scientists over a year or two, and over a weekend you could just write a piece that savages it and criticises it, usually on the basis of, oh, this reference was not included. Of course, dissent and controversy is great for science and great for the public. We need to get, as it were, nearer to the truth all the time. But these very rough, ready, shoddy, quickly penned critiques of large studies like the Kortenkamp study are not the sort of thing we want. It's clear that the overall objective is a bit like what the tobacco industry realized decades ago, which is to manufacture doubt, to call into question the quality, and to make it difficult for policymakers to take decisions.
Since science is at the heart of many political decisions, it is the target of partisan influence in the corridors of democracy. Industry exploits science to delay, water down, or fight regulations. Science lobbying is called manufacturing doubt. The strategy was invented by the tobacco industry in the 50s to prevent the implementation of public health measures against cigarettes.
Policymakers need to be aware about the scope for manufacturing doubt, about where it comes from, explicit memos written by tobacco in the 50s saying, if we can plant doubt in the minds of the public and decision makers, we can secure another 2 or 3 decades for our product, cigarettes. So it's a very explicit strategy, has been picked up by other groups who feel their products are threatened.
La science est faite de débats contradictoires, et c'est ce qui fait sa force d'ailleurs, c'est que c'est un processus de doute permanent, qu'on a besoin de ce doute permanent, et c'est d'ailleurs très sain d'un point de vue intellectuel de remettre en question ce qu'on pense de façon permanente. Et c'est là où c'est très pervers, c'est qu'en déformant artificiellement en fait, et en amplifiant ce doute-là, l'industrie parvient en fait à utiliser la science contre elle-même.
Uncertainty is the driving force behind science. But to protect us, Europe has a political tool called the precautionary principle. It would take too long to prove the link between the cause, endocrine disruptors, and their effects, illnesses that develop 8 months or 40 years later. We are not guinea pigs.
Of course, proof has to come from either damaged wildlife or damaged humans, or both. And to avoid it, one needs to be precautionary on evidence that's not 100% certain. So precaution comes in when you've got situations of complexity, uncertainty, scientific ignorance, in situations where there's enough evidence to suggest the plausibility, the possibility of perhaps very serious, widespread, irreversible problems like cancers or holes in the ozone layer, that type of issue.
The precautionary principle makes it possible to remove products from the market, which is a problem for business. Industry often uses the very same arguments to criticize the principle.
Le principe de précaution appliqué de manière abusive empêche l'innovation.
The precautionary principle stimulates innovation rather than inhibits it. And this works because we know there's a strong empirical base that says well-designed environmental regulations and green taxes stimulate innovation, mainly because it brings forth smarter alternatives.
Je ne connais pas d'exemple de produit qui a été suspendu en raison du principe de précaution et qui soit revenu ensuite sur le marché. Donc ça, c'est vraiment une application abusive du principe de précaution.
Of course, in any debate about the precautionary principle, the question arises, has it been overused or used inappropriately? With hindsight, we can see that there were opportunities and justifications for taking action much, much earlier, decades, in fact, in many of the cases.
The aim of chemical regulation in the European Union and anywhere else is to reveal dangers before exposures can happen. So we want to anticipate the dangers and want to make sure that exposures to humans never happen.
This is ground control to future generations. Science is on our side. Endocrine disruptors are a textbook case for the application of the precautionary principle. But industry can always bypass it.
If it does, we're lost. Watch out. The devil is in the details, and lobbying can be hidden in super technical documents.
Industry's first trick concerns the threshold question. In Europe, all chemicals must go through a sort of mill called REACH, an acronym for registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. The European Commission has to decide which tube to put endocrine disruptors through. Tube number 1, they're only dangerous above a certain threshold. Tube number 2, they are dangerous, full stop.
This means that we need to look at the science, try to understand it, and then make a decision on whether or not we think that predominantly science shows that all endocrine disruptors have a threshold, or all endocrine disruptors do not have a threshold, or maybe some have a threshold and some don't have a threshold.
Some people believe that if it can be shown that there is a threshold, then a decision on what is safe and what is not safe will be clear-cut. But that question is scientifically very difficult to answer, and signs are that we cannot determine any safe level of exposure for these chemicals.
First option, the Commission decides that there are no thresholds. In that case, endocrine disruptors would be banned and substituted. But nothing prevents the Commission from ignoring science and deciding that thresholds do exist. This is, of course, the second option that industry prefers. It would spare the majority of its products. So all they need to do is to persuade the Commission.
I think industry wants to have the right answer. And we believe at the moment, since we've considered thresholds to be a very real aspect of these substances, that the data will be presented to show where the thresholds are.
The second trick is hidden in the criteria for endocrine disruptors. DG Environment is working hard on a list including the severity of the effects, the potency of the effects, the irreversibility of the effects. All criteria would contribute to the development of a scientific identikit of the suspects. The industry's trick would be to filter endocrine disruptors and only select the most potent ones, thus clearing all the others.
Potency has some scientific justification when, for example, I need to label and regulate acutely toxic chemicals. Potency is important then. It is getting more complicated when it comes to carcinogens, reproductive toxicants, mutagens. Then these toxicities, and of course endocrine disruption, these toxicities are judged to be so important and so dangerous that potency is not considered anymore.
You can have a lot of very low potency chemicals that, if they hit the body at the most vulnerable time, are going to do their damage. They don't have to be mega potent to do their damage if they're there at the right time. So we think that using potency is just going the wrong way about it. It's the wrong indicator.
I think that potency is very much a science-based idea. You can have substances that behave in different ways, and this idea of how much is needed to cause an effect is what potency is about.
If we set up a system where we only take potent chemicals, it will essentially be a system that deals with some chemicals and not with others. And that seems to be something that would serve industry's purposes, and we don't necessarily believe it would serve the purpose of protecting public health.
The potency criteria may well only be an astute lobbying trick, but the industry has found heavyweight allies to help it: Germany and the United Kingdom.
The British authorities openly say that the labeling of a chemical as an endocrine disruptor has enormous commercial consequences, which is true, but therefore they want to regulate only the worst offenders. So the idea would be to use the criterion of potency as a tool to cream off from the top the worst offenders and leave the rest of endocrine disrupting chemicals totally unregulated.
This potency trick is something the pesticide industry could do with. In 2009, Parliament concocted a personal mill for it and decided that all pesticides identified as endocrine disruptors should be withdrawn from the market. If industry manages to impose the potency criteria, it will be able to reduce the radical consequences of its mistreatment.
Sur la base des 400 molécules aujourd'hui qui restent en Europe pour protéger l'ensemble des cultures, nous estimons, nous, aujourd'hui, qu'une bonne cinquantaine de substances pourraient être amenées à être considérées comme perturbateurs endocriniens et donc disparaître. Et
And what do they represent in the market share?
Ces 50 produits représentent aujourd'hui globalement 40% de la valeur du marché européen, qui est donc estimé entre 8 et 9 milliards d'euros.
That doesn't mean to say that agriculture will close down. There's, of course, alternatives. There's organic farming. There's integrated pest management. But the various entities are looking at the implications of these criteria and conjugating those and saying, this will be bad for my business.
Potency criteria or threshold? DG Environment refuses to give in to exterior pressure, but its resistance begins to cause concern within the European Commission itself. And its betrayal is organised under the Commission's very roof. two directorates general in particular are annoyed. DG Enterprise, which is responsible for the well-being of industry, and DG Sanko, in charge of health and consumers. But whose health?
Sur la question des perturbateurs endocriniens, on a vu que la DG Environnement était plutôt dans la défense de la santé publique et la DG Santé et Consommateurs, moins, beaucoup moins.
What we know is that the pesticides industry has an open door anytime they want to see DG Sanko. And these are things that lead us to believe that part of DG Sanko's purposes is not only to do their risk assessment and risk management, but to make sure that the pesticide industry isn't completely outraged with them, if I can put it that way.
To general astonishment and without warning, DG Sanko initiates a parallel process in competition with the work of DG Environment. It mandates an official agency, the European Food Safety Authority, the EFSA. So the EFSA must also give its opinion on endocrine disruptors. An ingenious bureaucratic sleight of hand. If the EFSA validates the demands of the industry, DG Environment will have to change its course.
Colleagues of mine said they were sure EFSA would come out in favor of potency-based cutoff values as proposed by industry and various other member states.
It was clear that DG Environment was meant to be in charge of developing that, and they had created an inclusive process, and it was Sanko that had delegated the task to Environment. They could have said, no, we want to do it. But then first you delegate it and then you create your parallel process is not really very good administration.
Well, I think you can take it.
That's fine.
We were informed more or less at the same time as the request was made. I don't have the dates.
Not a single civil servant of DG Environment was sent a copy of the mandate signed by the director of DG Sanko on the 1st of August 2012.
No, we received it a few days afterwards, indeed.
No comment from DG Sanko on this brutal short circuit. Its director, Paola Testori Koji, cancels our interview at the last moment.
Si je dois insister auprès de Madame Testori pour l'avoir elle, c'est avoir les questions par avant.
The official explanation? The Commission spokesman does not understand, he says, why several people need to be interviewed. In support, DG Enterprise also refuses to give an interview.
Pour augmenter les chances d'avoir 3 interlocuteurs au niveau directeur général, je vous propose que vous m'envoyiez les questions par avant.
On the pretext that the Commission has only one voice, DG Environment is forced to fake a love affair, when in fact everyone sleeps in a different room.
The reason why they didn't want to be interviewed or answering your request, well, we've decided within the Commission on your request that we in DG Environment, having the lead on the file of endocrine disruption, should perform this interview with you and give you all the feedback that we can on behalf of our colleagues in the different services.
And finally, there is no trace of any potency criteria in the EFSA's report. DG Sanko's little game is a fiasco.
Potency-based cutoff values are arbitrary, they are not supported by scientific evidence, and accordingly EFSA, like everyone else, saw this and came out not recommending them strongly.
Under siege by the lobbies, pressed by some member states and now isolated within the Commission, DG Environment still refuses to give in to pressure. In March 2013, the European Parliament sends in reinforcements. It doesn't have much power over the Commission, but adopts a resolution asking it to reject the ideas of a threshold and a cut-off criterion such as potency. Most of all, it calls for urgent action.
The Parliament thought this is an important moment to provide also the view of Parliament to the Commission, so to give its political input, because it had become clear, due to the heavy lobbying of especially the UK and Germany, representing industry interests of the pesticides industry, that the Commission was under pressure. So without this resolution, we would probably be in a far worse situation.
La Commission peut tout à fait concrètement s'asseoir dessus si elle a envie. Elle ne le fait pas en général parce que politiquement c'est suicidaire, mais elle peut dire oui merci, on va regarder ça tout de suite et puis ne rien répondre dans les 6 mois, dans les 18 mois, etc.
At the end of May 2013, DG Environment brings 3 years of work to a close. It submits its proposition to the whole European Commission. It hasn't given in. Exit the threshold and the potency criterion. Au revoir endocrine disruptors in potatoes and dolls. At last we can be born in peace. But DG Sanko's betrayal was in fact just a warning. All of a sudden, nothing. Blackout. Total paralysis.
Something must have happened in the European Commission. I'm not privy to this debate, but someone must have pulled a brake, because all of a sudden what surfaced was the idea of having to conduct a so-called impact assessment. Everyone knows impact assessments in the European Union take at least a year, if not longer. Why now? Why does this happen half a year before the deadline set by the European Parliament to the European Commission?
Since our whole activity up until June was based on developing science-based criteria, we had not made very many efforts on the economic part. We also need to take into account that what we do may have a negative impact on the economy, and we have to make our decisions aware of that impact.
Hey, non, hein, hey. Non.